Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our HS2 online conference day, where we're going to be exploring the archaeology of HS2 along different themes. We have a packed and exciting programme for you today. As you can imagine, we'd originally intended to do this live in person, but with the new regulations and restrictions, we've taken this conference online to make sure we're still giving you the latest news and stories from the HS2 archaeology. Before we begin, I'm going to pop on a short video which will give everyone the opportunity to check that your sound is working, that your videos are working and your speakers are all turned on. Make sure the volume is turned up and you have a good internet connection. A good internet connection is really vital for today's lectures, so make sure there's no one streaming videos or films or playing internet games, that your computer's not downloading any updates, and that you're sat nice and close to your router, not at the end of the garden. All the lectures you see today will be available on YouTube should you miss anything. So I'm going to pop on a quick video that gives you all an update on why we're doing archaeology on the route of HS2, and I'll be back with you in a moment.
The creation of HS2 is the biggest infrastructure project in Europe. The first new intercity railway to be built north of London in over a century. HS2 is being built in two phases. Phase 1 will link London and the West Midlands and is due to be completed by 2026. In Phase 2, the line will extend to Crewe by 2027 and followed by new lines towards Manchester and Leeds by 2033. But before we build bridges, tunnels, tracks and stations, an unprecedented amount of archaeological work will take place along the line of the route. HS2's archaeology programme is the largest ever undertaken in the UK. This once-in-a-generation opportunity allows us to reveal over 10,000 years of British history. Come with us as we take a train through time. Our journey starts a long time ago in the Paleolithic period, where early ancestors roamed in groups hunting and gathering food, then settled and learned how to farm and discovered the secrets of making bronze and iron. We will then travel forward in time to see the mark the Romans left on Britain. From their straight roads and new systems of government to sanitation and town planning. Following the departure of the Romans, we head into medieval Britain. We'll see the effect the Black Death had on villages, towns and cities, and gain insight into how critical battles in the Wars of the Roses unfolded. The final leg of our journey takes us to the Industrial Revolution, where the landscape and infrastructure of Britain saw dramatic changes. Factories were built and the economy grew. In the 19th century, the steam rail network revolutionised how we moved goods and people across the country. In the 21st century, HS2 gives us a chance to do so again, creating a fairer, more balanced and prosperous Britain. Using the skills and expertise of an unprecedented number of archaeologists, all artefacts and human remains will be treated with the dignity, care and respect they deserve. And all discoveries will be shared with communities, retelling the stories of our past, helping us understand what made us as a country. The sheer scale of possible discoveries, the geographical span, and the vast range of our history to be unearthed makes HS2's archaeology programme a unique opportunity to tell the story of Britain, whilst leaving a lasting legacy for generations to come.
So, on to the conference. So what we've done for these lectures is to enable them to be a bit more dynamic and for our experts to present videos and 3D models and all that kind of thing. We've pre-recorded the 4 lectures. So our first lecture today is with Dr. Inés, and she's going to be talking about the archaeobotanical evidence for HS2. So I will pop her lecture on now. And then after the lecture, Inés will be joining us for a live question and answer session. So the lecture itself is pre-recorded, question and answers will be live. I hope you enjoy it. I'll see you after the lecture.
Welcome to this session on environmental archaeology for the Heritage Open Days at HS2. I'm going to speak about archaeobotanical evidence for the proposed HS2 routes along Staffordshire and Warwickshire. My name is Inés López-Dóriga and I'm the lead environmental archaeologist at Wessex Archaeology. First, I'm going to do a small introduction to what's environmental archaeology, starting with ecofacts. So we environmental archaeologists study ecofacts, which are environmental remains, so any remains from plants and animals that may be found in archaeological sites. And they tell us about what people were using and how they were interacting with the environment, as well as how the landscape was. So, for example, some ecofacts that you might think of are snail shells, or crustacean remains, animal bones, that's the most typical one, but also we have sometimes insects and invertebrates, plant remains, seeds and pollen and other plant remains that are microscopic. So in particular, I'm going to focus on plant remains, also known as archaeobotanical remains. We have two main types of archaeobotanical remains. We have macro remains and micro remains, and the difference between them is mostly that they are studied with different types of microscopes, and macro remains are visible with the naked eye, while micro remains are not visible with the naked eye. So examples of microbotanical remains are pollen grains, for example, spores, phytoliths, starch, and diatoms. So pollen are microscopic, and they tell us about the landscape. They usually turn up in archaeological sites and are representative of the surrounding vegetation. They sometimes can be found in containers, for example, pottery remains that have contained honey, for example, and can be traced to the origin of the honey. We find spores as well in pollen samples. And they tell us as well about different types of plants in the environment. We have phytoliths, which are silica bodies that are released by plants when they decompose or when they are processed. And the advantage of phytoliths over other types of plant remains is that they survive in most conditions, although they cannot be identified very precisely. We also have starch. Starch granules are containing underground plant parts like tubers and rhizomes, and we may find them in archaeological sites when these plant parts have been processed, although the actual tubers or rhizomes do not survive any longer. And we also have diatoms, which are useful to reconstruct wet environments. So these are unicellular algae and may be found in ditches, for example, and we can try to analyze if the ditches used to contain water or if they were seasonally dry and seasonally wet, etc. And macro remains, our macrobotanical remains, are the ones that are going to be the focus of my talk. And we have lots of different types. The most frequent one, maybe it's wood or wood charcoal when it's carbonized, but there are many other different types of non-woody plant macro remains, like seeds and chaff, stalks, seed pods, stems, leaves and berries, cones, roots and tubers, capsules, and thorns, for example. We also have transformed botanical remains like wooden objects, textile objects made with plant fibers. We also have, as the case here in this example, plant imprints. So in pottery, when the pottery wasn't dry, we might have imprints of the plants that have been in touch with the vessel. We also have food remains. This is very rare, but sometimes found, like bread. We also have crusts in pottery. So this is a rim of a pottery vessel, and it has a crust here that is of plant origin. And we also have coprolites like this, in which we can often find plant parts that haven't been digested, and we can have a glimpse into diet. It's very important to consider how plant remains are preserved in archaeological sites to understand what they mean and why they are there. So the most frequent way of preserving plant remains in archaeological sites is carbonization. So we have charred plant remains here. charred plant remains or carbonized plant remains, it has to do a little bit with the amount of oxygen while the fire was taking part. And basically, to summarize, the stronger the fire, the less chances of plant remains to be preserved by carbonization, because they tend to disappear. Other types of preservation of plant remains are mineralization or phosphatic replacement, for example. Waterlogging. So in this example here, we have waterlogged plant remains. These are usually plants that are natural in the environment and are preserved in deposits like here in a permanently wet ditch or in a very deep well where the phreatic water level is quite high. We also have mineralized plant remains that may be preserved in some of these deposits, but the difference is they need organic matter in the composition be deposited with them to be able to experiment phosphatic replacement. Another type of mineralization is in contact with metal objects like this one here. But the most frequent way of finding mineralized plant remains is in cesspits, like this example here. So, yeah, as I said, 90% of what we study is carbonized plant remains or charred plant remains. And the problem with that is that not all plants survive fire. So we have a very important bias. So what do we do with our results with studying environmental remains? Well, we do reconstruct, or we try to reconstruct the environment. So these are examples of reconstructions of landscapes that have been done by my colleagues at Wessex Archaeology of different sites and type of landscapes. But we also are interested in human-environment interactions. So because our plant remains, and well, any remain in general, appear in archaeological sites usually because of human activities, we don't always have complete representations and accurate representations on how the landscape was. What we have a representation of what parts of the landscape and the natural resources people used in the past. So one of the most important objectives in environmental archaeology is studying what people were eating in the past. So we have many different ways of studying this. So for example, in teeth, we might have phytolith remains or starch remains that might represent what people were eating. We occasionally may find food remains like these carbonized fragments of biscuit or bread. We also have pottery, crusts on pottery, but the most frequent case is carbonized deposits, and we may have difficulties in interpreting why they are carbonized and are they actually food remains, or were they accidentally carbonized, or were they actually exploited for something else completely different. So yeah, all of that is open to interpretation. In addition, we can try to reconstruct activities. So for example, with serial assemblages, we may have different parts of the cereal. So we can have grains, or we can have chaff, and we can have the weeds that go with the cereal crops, and each of them tell us about different processes of cereal processing. So for example, if we find something in this stage here, we can be fairly confident that those activities took place, but yeah, again, it's open to interpretation. And sometimes we may be able to study how the crop fields were. So yeah, it's good enough to say, yeah, cereal wheat was cultivated in certain period, but if we look at the wild plant remains that go with the wheat, we can say which techniques were used. So for example, cropping at low height, or at a height from a distance from the floor, depending on the type of plants that were collected. So we have several problems in addition to taxonomy, which is formation processes and the differential preservation associated to charring or the other ways of preserving archaeobotanical remains. One of the problems is vertical movement of remains within the deposit. So earthworms are very active animals that are very good at transporting tiny pieces of plant remains in the soil, even when they are charred. So when we have small deposits with a few plant remains, we need to be cautious when we interpret them because they might be intrusive. Other ways in which we can encounter problems is by accidental arrival of plant remains to archaeological sites. So, for example, spiky seeds like these may be transported by humans attached to their clothes or by animals attached to the fur and may appear in archaeological sites by accident. Or other cases, so for example, transportation by wind, seeds may be easily displaced depending on the type of seed, or by water, other types of seeds. And we also have, as I mentioned before, weeds that grow in crop fields and they appear in archaeological sites accidentally, although they are very useful for interpretation. I also want to speak about the environmental archaeology we do at Wessex Archaeology. So we have a team of 7 people, and we do all stages of environmental work, from processing to assessment and analysis. So here my colleagues Jenny and Liz are processing samples by flotation, which is a process in which sediment from the sites is deposited on a tank, and the light floating things like seeds and charcoal float, and this aids in the analysis. We also have Fiona, who does that in Sheffield, and Liz, who is involved in some of the microscope work as well in Sheffield. Nikki is here doing some sorting of samples under the microscope. So after the samples have been processed, we obtain the light floating fraction, which is called a float, and this is scanned on the microscope to find the tiny seeds and other environmental remains. So this is a picture taken during flotation. So a bucket of sediment here has been already put on a tank, and this is what we end up with. This is a heavy fraction where we may have artifacts, and this is the flotation fraction or float that has all the environmental material. And these are examples of different types of floats. So this is a waterlogged float full of hazelnuts, but most of our floats are carbonized and look like this, and they have a bit of root as well. The next stage is identification. So after sorting has been done, different types of environmental remains are separated. I have a look at the seeds and I try to identify them in comparison with different publications, but also our reference collection. So it's very important to have a modern reference collection of material. So now I'm going to speak about environmental archaeology, specifically in the sites that we have studied along the HS2 North route. And this comes from 2 counties, Staffordshire and Warwickshire mostly. And we have studied only one site in Staffordshire so far, Ryknield Street, and several sites in Warwickshire. I also want to clarify that we have 2 types of investigations that have been deployed in HS2 sites. So we have evaluations and we have mitigations. And for those of you who are not familiar with them, evaluations are very brief investigations on site just to check how the preservation of evidence is there and whether the site warrants more in-depth investigation. So it's really just to get an idea of how the site is. And mitigations are usually open plan excavations, and they are carried out on those specific areas which are identified as having the more potential during the evaluations. So mitigations usually follow evaluations. And most of the sites we are going to be looking at we've only undertaken the evaluation so far, so we don't have a very complete idea of what was happening on site and what environmental evidence is present. We only have a preliminary idea. So many of these results that I'm going to present later are a bit partial or preliminary. And we also undertake two types of study of our evidence once since it's been excavated. So we assess the information and we decide how much potential it has. And then when we find something that warrants further study, we propose it for analysis and we undertake it. But we hardly ever undertake analysis of the whole of the evidence that we find unless it's really, really useful. So very often we find samples with very little in them and we only assess them. So for example, the first site that I'm going to speak about, Ryknield Street, had quite interesting archaeology with Bronze Age deposits, including some cremations. However, the environmental evidence wasn't very interesting. Well, it was very sparsely preserved. Only a few cereal grains and tubers here and there, and just a few of the features. And because it's just a few of them, we don't really know if they are intrusive, because we have evidence of earthworm activity. So we really need to date these cereal remains. So we have examples of barley, which you have here an example of uncharred barley, modern barley, and the carbonized remains. These are not from this site, but it's just an example, so you can see how they look like. And these are about 3 millimeters long. And these ones here are wheat remains, free threshing wheat. We've also found tubers, so onion couch tubers, which carbonized look like this, but in real life look like this. If we manage to date these remains and we prove that they are contemporary with the deposits we are studying, this can be quite interesting because we will prove that, for example, free threshing wheat was cultivated in the Bronze Age, which is quite early for Britain. This type of cereal, which comprises several species, was cultivated in early farming societies in Europe, but in Britain it doesn't become widespread until Saxon times. So we really need to date these remains to find out how important they are. We have also to look carefully at the tubers of onion couch. Onion couch tubers are often found in ritual or funerary deposits across Europe in different sites of different chronologies, but mostly prehistoric. And there is a lot of debate on why these remains appear in that type of sites. So there are many researchers who think that they are deposited with cremation priors, as here as a modern example. They think that they could be fewer, but it also could be a sort of offering for accompany that person in the trip to the afterlife, or they might just be accidentally carbonized and just be present in the soil. However, we don't find other things that should be present in the soil, so it's a bit suspicious. But there is no agreement on how these remains were or why they were present. Our colleague Ashley Tuck has tried to eat them roasted, and he's found that they are really nice and tasty. So it might be that they were actually food offerings and were given to the dead for accompanying their trip. Another site we have studied further south is Drayton Basset. This is not really exciting yet. Hopefully it will be more exciting later, but very little archaeology was recovered, and it just included a pit with a lot of charcoal. The problem is we don't know how old this charcoal is, because there wasn't any artifactual evidence that could be phased. So we need to get a radiocarbon date on the charcoal deposit to find out how old it was, and if it was just a single species, or for example from a tree that burned down, or maybe it was actually a hearth and has different types of charcoal species that may have been used as fuel. Second site on Warwickshire is Northwood. Again, we have very sparse evidence from this site. It was just a few cereal grains, like these ones on top, bed seeds, but they were large seeded, so could be potentially cultivated species like pea or bean or lentil, and also hazelnut cell fragments. So you have here the charred example and the uncarbonized example. So we know that there was human activity in the area, but we don't know when this activity happened. And we don't know either if all these resources were exploited at the same time, or if they just have become deposited together on a date of a different period. Orton is another site that we have studied in Warwickshire. And in this site, the most interesting evidence is a burnt mound, which is basically a pile of rocks full of evidence of heat activity or fire exposure, and they have lots of charcoal, as you can imagine. And we don't really know how burnt mounds worked, or why they were there, or what was the use that people had for them. But one of the hypotheses that I find quite interesting is that they were associated to cooking. So these burnt mounds are often associated to pits that are full of rocks and charcoal again, so very similar deposits. And sometimes they are also associated to water courses, but not necessarily always. And there are several cooking, there's been several cooking experiments based on ethnographic evidence of different sort of traditional societies in which cooking was undertaken in pits, and it could be with water or without water, but basically it involved heating the stones to make sort of slow cooking, so it could become a very fashionable trend these days. And the remains produced by that sort of experiment are very similar to what we find in burnt mounds. So it could be one of the hypotheses which we would like to check. Other evidence that we have found from this site is from a later period, so mostly Romano-British. Our colleagues have found on site enclosure that you can hopefully see here or here as well. And this is dated to the Romano-British period. We have found some chaff remains, so parts of the cereal spikes, for example, from here. And this has been identified to a hulled wheat species, so it could be emmer or spelt, for example. And none of those cereals were cultivated after the Romano-British periods in general across Britain. So we can be quite certain that this evidence is from that period, although we haven't found much else. Coleshill is probably the most interesting sites of the ones that we are studying at Wessex Archaeology. It has a multi-period occupation, although the environmental evidence is most interesting for the medieval period. This is a reconstruction of the medieval manor. But we also have evidence from earlier periods, so Bronze Age and Iron Age, as well as Romano-British. So for the Bronze Age, we have another burnt mound full of charcoal, so we haven't studied it in detail yet, but we hope to do some micromorphology to study formation processes of the burnt mound. We hope also to undertake radiocarbon dating, because our prior experience in this type of deposit is that different pieces of charcoal from the same burnt mound may have a quite important age difference. So they may have been features or structures that were used for a very long time. In the Iron Age, in Coleshill, we have found evidence of human domestic processing activities. So again, as in the previous case of Water Orton, we have found some cereal chaff remains that evidence crop processing activities associated to the last stages, so they were undertaken on site, probably on a piecemeal basis when cereals were needed. And this is only found with whole wheats because those type of cereals required double the effort that the wheats that we have now require. So, for example, our current wheats are called free threshing because they are just, they are very easily threshed, while hull wheats require dehusking after they have been threshed because the chaff sort of sticks to it. So they require more labor, but they are very good because they are more resistant. So it was probably quite a valuable resource for early farming communities. We have found also remains of wild plants, like for example, this is a carbonized seed of cleaver, and these may have arrived accidentally to the site, but it could have also been intentionally exploited, so we need to look into that. For the Romano-British period in Coleshill, we have similar deposits to those of the Iron Age. So we have crop processing remains, but we have sprouted cereals, like these examples here. This picture is not from Coleshill, but it's from a similar site that we've studied recently. And these are sprouted spelt grains, and we don't know why these spelt grains were sprouted. Could have been accidentally. It could have been a wet year, and the crop was wet and before it was collected, so people brought it to the site and tried to make it useful. But it could have been also a part of the some of processing activities. So, for example, it could have been part of malting or brewing. So we need to look into the deposit very carefully. We need to measure the sprout in each of the grains and find out if it was, or try to interpret if it was accidental or intentional. But for me, the most interesting part in Coleshill is the medieval assemblage. So we have found two very interesting samples in the evaluation. We haven't undertaken yet the mitigation of the medieval area in Coleshill. This sample from the evaluation had lots of cereal grains, and it didn't have almost anything else. So it didn't have any chaff, or it didn't have any wheat seeds. So it's quite likely that these grains were carbonized either while somebody was cooking and had an accident, or they could have been carbonized while they were stored, for example, in a barn or a different type of storage place for cereal. And the other side, the other sample, it's very interesting because it doesn't have any cereal grain. It has lots of seeds of wildflowers and wild plants that may have been found in a meadow. So, for example, cleavers, mallow, scarlet pimpernel, plantain, stinking mayweed, fumitory, meadowgrass, cat's tail, trefoil, corncockle, fescue, ryegrass. So there are several hypotheses to interpret this assemblage. For example, it could have been seed bank that was naturally present in the soil, and people were using turf as a fuel, for example. It could have been present in the dung from animals that were kept in pens during winter, and then when they were taken out to fields to graze, they would have cleaned the pen and probably burned the dung accumulated there. It could have been that this was growing on a field that was left fallow, and then it was weeded before sowing a crop. But yeah, it's it's a very, very interesting sample that reminds me of one of those seed packages for wildflowers that you can find very, very often in shops. And something that we will be looking at in the mitigation of Coleshill are the occupation floors with food waste, probably from domestic exploitation of plants in the manor or by the people living in the manor. And hopefully this will provide a lot of interesting remains to study differences in diet in different areas, people living in different areas of the manor. After Coleshill, going south, we have a site called Kenilworth, which wasn't as interesting in terms of environmental evidence. We have a few bits of charred plant remains here and there. Yeah, as you are familiar already with this, it's cereal grains or wild plant seeds and also charcoal. But in Kenilworth, there was a area with in Milburn Grange, which is one of the areas that were taken to mitigation from Kenilworth because of the presence of Mesolithic evidence. We have found some deposits full of hazelnuts, which are quite interesting because hazelnuts were presumably very important resources in the Mesolithic. Hopefully we will be able to date them and prove that they were actually Mesolithic. And yeah, even in the Neolithic period and after farming was introduced, hazelnuts kept playing an important role in subsistence because they were easily storable resources. So if you gather hazelnuts in autumn and you dry them properly, you have a food source that is reliable over the winter until more plants become available in spring. Some people have even argued that there was a hazelnut economy in the Mesolithic, so we are looking forward to test this hypothesis in Milburn Grange. Crew Farm, it's another case of scanty environmental evidence, so we have a few bits of charcoal here and there, a few bits of cereal grains and some hazelnuts, but we don't know yet of what period it was, and we don't know if they are contemporary, so it's not a very exciting case of environmental archaeology, I would say. And another site that we have studied towards the south of our area is River Lim, where we found some evidence of crop processing activities belonging to the Iron Age. This led to the mitigation of an area and where we found also barley and remains of spelt wheat and emmer wheat. So when we started investigating this site, we didn't know if both the species of wheat were cultivated on the site at the same time, but thanks to the mitigation, we actually found those species in the same samples. This is quite interesting because sometimes we tend to associate emmer with early periods, so Bronze Age, Iron Age, and then it sort of gets replaced by spelt wheat in the Romano-British period. However, in this case, we found both species, so it could be either a transitional period or the people were deploying risk strategies against crop failure, just in case, for example, there was a bad season and one of the crops failed, then they would have the other one to rely on. So this area of River Lim, which we took to mitigation, is known as Cubbington Woods. And in addition to the 2 species of wheat that we found, we also found lots of seeds of wild plants. And although some of these may have been intentionally gathered for different uses, and they belong to different parts of the landscape, and we may reconstruct these different environments near the site, some of these plants may have been weeds or undesirable plants in the crops that were cultivated by people living there. And as such, they are very interesting because different types of wild plants have different habitat preferences and different soil preferences. So this is, for example, an example of a soil map, and we could have plants that grow in this type of soil and plants that grow in this type of soil. So we know that people were having crop fields in different areas with different requirements. We may also have plants that grow quite high or plants that are very low to the ground. So these help us identify different processing strategies and agricultural techniques. We may also find roots that tell us that maybe crops were gathered by uprooting rather than cutting. So we help to find lots of evidence. So yeah, that's all from me. That's all the environmental evidence that I've studied so far from HS2 sites. And thank you for your attention.
So it is now your opportunity. We've got a few minutes. It's your opportunity for you to ask us some questions. So using the question box on the screen, your questions for Inés. And let's have a look. Inés, are you there with us?
I am.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us. That was a really interesting lecture. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for listening.
No, thank you. So I guess the first question is, how far along are you with your research about the environmental archaeology so far? Is there more to do?
Yeah, there is a lot more to do. So we are, I would say, less than 50%. So we are still doing the assessment of most of the sites. Some of them are still in the evaluation phase. So there's still a lot of excavation to be done. Then we need to finish all the assessment of the evidence, and we will propose things for analysis, and then we will produce the analysis, the results of the interpretation, etc. So still a lot of work to do.
And David is asking, will your evaluation aggregate the different areas of interest to check on the land use across the different communities, or is it done site by site?
We do it side by side. I don't know if HS2, the client, the consultant, will have a plan of putting it together, but from our point of view, side by side, and then put in the regional context of the what's ever been found in the area in general, not only on that side.
And I think it's fair to say that the research doesn't finish here, does it? It's, you know, this information is put into the public domain and then people can do their own research in years to come, yeah?
Yes, exactly. So many of the materials will eventually be deposited in a museum, and it will be available for anyone who wants to do some research on them.
Thank you very much. And another question, how did you get to become an environmental scientist? How did you end up at Wessex Archaeology doing what you do?
So, for example, in my case, I did a PhD in prehistory and archaeology with specialization in archaeobotany. But other people may have different pathways, so they might come through biology, for example, and then do a specialization in biology applied to archaeology. So it's really open. There is not a set path that you can follow.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And from all the different samples that you've seen that have come across through your labs, what's your favourite ecofact to work with?
I don't know. Well, charred plant remains, for example, I would say probably hazelnuts, because they have been used in human history from prehistory to the present time, and they are really valuable, very tasty, very useful for hunter-gatherers because they can be stored, and reliable food source. So I think that's my favorite.
Thank you. And a question, this is from Sally. I think I can answer this one. Sally says, can I understand the process when we say move to mitigation? And Inés, can you clarify, when we say we're going to move to mitigation, what does that mean?
So after the evaluation, so when different trenches or test pits have been done on a site, and we have identified the areas with more potential, we do mitigation or excavation, which is basically a whole open plan excavation of the area to retrieve anything that is there. So just rather than test pits or trenches, just the whole area. And it will mean that even though the area will be affected by development, we will mitigate the sort of heritage destruction of the area by doing this research very thoroughly.
Yeah, I think that's a very a very good definition of how we define mitigation. No problem, Sally. I've just seen you said thank you. That's no problem at all. So if there are any other questions, this is the time to get them in. Coming up next, we're going to have another session, and I will give you the details for that now. Inés will stay on the line in case there's any other questions. So coming up later this afternoon, we've got 3 more lectures. We've got Death and Burial, which will be starting at about 11 o'clock. We've got Geoarchaeology after that, and we're finishing off with a finds session at the very end of the day. All the links to sign up for those are in the chat section. And we would really appreciate it if you could head over after the session and give us some feedback on this session. So I'll pop a link to that in the chat now. Inés, there are no more questions. Have you got any final closing thoughts you'd like to finish with?
No, I would just like to thank everybody for listening, as well my colleagues in Wessex Archaeology for all the work in the background to make this possible.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Inés, and thank you for dialing in on a Saturday to answer those questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much, Inés. That's great.